Hi, everyone. I'm Nick Robbins. I will be chairing, such as it is, this event tonight. And I want to thank everyone for coming to help celebrate Esther Chadwick and her new brilliant and essential book, The Radical Print, Art and Politics in Late 18th Century Britain, which was published last summer by the Mellon Center for Studies in British Art. It is a real pleasure to be helping to launch this book for my friend, who has been, for me, a model scholar and co-conspirator since I was a wee grad student. And we are lucky to have a crack team assembled tonight to respond to the book, who I will introduce now just very briefly. Richard Taws, President and Head of the President of Art History at Stephanie O'Rourke, Senior Lecturer in Art History at St. Andrews, and Johanna Gosse, Lecturer in Lens and Time-Based Art here at the Courtauld. Thank you all for taking the time to be here. The panelists, just to let you know, will each give a short response to different works from Esther's book, with the aim of sharing something of the marvelous texture, both of the prints the book discusses and of the searching analysis that Esther applies to them. We will then open up for a conversation among us, which will be followed by a lovely reception, with thanks to the PMC as well for helping to sponsor the evening. And not to be forgotten, a chance to purchase the book. There are physical copies. 20% discount, so this is a very good opportunity. Extra 10% for Courtauld students and staff. Card payments, I am told, are welcome. There will also be vouchers for those who don't want to buy a book tonight. But the question of how to pay for goods and what medium of exchange and what representations of value we can believe in, it's actually not immaterial to our discussion tonight. The Radical Print provides us with an entirely new and original guide to the age of paper, to a late 18th century world in which ideas, debates, relationships, commerce, and indeed politics were thoroughly mediated by paper. And it identifies in the decades around 1800 a set of critical printmaking practices which reflected upon and intervened in the world of printed and inscribed sheets, and this world of revolutionary politics and fractured publics. In this book, we encounter the work of 5 artists and engravers, James Barry, John Hamilton Mortimer, James Gillray, Thomas Bewick, and William Blake, who redefined the capacity of print. The prints, Esther shows us, are radical because of the way they are made and because of the political debates to which they are addressed. They bring us to the heart or to the root of the matter. The book unhitches print from hierarchies of originality and material heft, which both in the late 18th century and much of the time still in ours, sees print as minor, derivative, or supplemental. Throughout, we are instead taught how to see print in insistent relation to the social life and the aesthetic logic of other kinds of paper, such as incendiary pamphlets, the varia of the newspaper page, or the letter and its uncertain passage through surveilled space. One remarkable thing about this book is the way it argues for the critical potential of print in the age of revolution. We are used to seeing print in dialogue with the spaces of publicity for high art in the 18th century, to seeing the relationship between the print seller's window and the walls of the Royal Academy. Building on essential work on print's role in the public sphere, Esther's book takes us to other spaces, and in the process identifies the space of politics not only as a public space crowded with bodies looking at the latest political satire or latest history painting, but also to the less visible but no less febrile world of the engraver's studio. What would it mean, she asked, to see the, quote, commercial artisanal spaces of the engraver's workshop as a place where some of the most sophisticated image making in this moment occurred? But also, what would it mean to see politics being worked through at the level of metallic matrix, acid wash, or ink-marked page? So I'll just briefly introduce the 5 chapters, which will then be more eloquently elaborated upon. In James Barrie's Phoenix, and in the context of the American Revolution, we find an artist working with and against print's reproducibility, and in the process, developing a novel way of situating the subject in time that both recurs and advances, a time of repetition and rupture that constitutes the contemporary. In John Hamilton Mortimer's Capriccio prints, which seem utterly different from Barrie's direct political subject, Esther shows Mortimer to be articulating a new political positionality for the artist, one seeking freedom, paradoxically, through imitation and through the marketplace. James Gillray's densely referential etchings are seen anew for the way they thematize problems of communication and mediation, where print is a site not necessarily for transparent communication, but for distorted and distributed reception. Thomas Bewick's famous tailpieces are resituated in a wonderful chapter that places this work, aside Bewick's other work, Engraving Currency, debates about the mediation of the printed image, and his utterly ingenious translations across print mediums. And last but far from least, Esther provides a brilliant rereading of William Blake's perplexing lacune from the 1820s, finding in it that Blake harnessed his work to millenarian renewal and revolutionary change, a context in which engraving itself can be understood as a prayerful remaking of the world from its foundations. As much as the book gives us utterly compelling and fresh readings of the so-called content of the prints under question, it also allows us to come in close to the texture of the work, and in the process, to the materiality of labor. We do not forget in this book the amount of time and thought it took for these image makers to produce these marvelous images. How Barrie could play with accidents of foul biting in his aquatints, how Bewick's incredible trompe-l'oeil print required profound material knowledge about the effects of impressions, or indeed the immense length of time laid down in Blake's careful return to the meticulous linear grammar of the reproductive engraving. Print scholarship can be very formidable for outsiders like me. And one thing I really appreciate about this book is how you patiently explain to us how these objects came into being, not only so that we can understand just how magical the effects are, but also to recover this world in which artistic work, in its most essential and unmediated sense, can be an intervention into the world. So congratulations, Esther. So I'm going to now turn things over to our panelists, starting with Stephanie O'Rourke, who will bring us back to Barrie's Phoenix. And I'm going to give you the clicker.
Oh, thank you.
You don't need it.
We were told to focus on one. The person who did that. Right, well, it is a rare pleasure to read a book that is as deeply researched and boldly original as the radical print. The text is inventive in its very structure, as Nick's already sketched out, because it's ordered around 5 key prints that are treated with the kind of sustained and ambitious analysis typically reserved for painting in this period. And it seems fitting that a scholar who is exceptionally attuned to the material practices of her artists would, like them, stage her argument on the level of form as well as content. Esther, Chadwick, and I have known each other since the earnest, doe-eyed days of our early PhDs, and it's always been such a pleasure to think with her. I always knew that she would produce a substantial and important contribution to the field of art history with this book. And what I did not expect in reading it, and it's such a pleasure to read, was how much it genuinely stretched my thinking about print's material intelligence and the kind of the recalcitrance and even, I think, the outlandishness of late 18th century British printmakers. Art historians are accustomed to believing that it was in mid-19th century European painting, I'm thinking especially of Courbet, Manet, and so on, that artistic devices of self-referentiality and pictorial ambiguity came to coincide with the politics of critique. This hyper-canonical modernist refrain that self-awareness and indeterminacy in artworks necessarily express critique and subversion has perpetuated the field's inability to recognize the extent to which this was not unique to late 19th and early 20th century Europe especially. And one of Esther's incisive moves in this book is to place that modernist narrative and sort of transform it and situate it in a much earlier moment and a seemingly much less important medium. And one of the many things that I would be curious to hear Esther speak about is what a reactionary print would be. And can a print that comments upon its status as a print retain an affiliation to the ideological status quo? How secure is the equivalence of artistic self-referentiality and political critique? Now, this book opens with a really beautiful reading of James Barrie's The Phoenix of 1776, a print in which Barrie himself joins John Milton, Andrew Marvell, John Locke, and others to mourn the death of the allegorical figure of freedom in Britain in the foreground. Across the water, however, freedom rises anew above the temple of American liberty, present-day politics notwithstanding. From the book's opening, then, we are immersed in a world in which prints recorded and, importantly, interacted with an era of revolutions: the American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution. And representing contemporary political events was a dangerous business, of course, which was typically undertaken through the playful and self-ironizing pictorial language of satire. And while Barrie's print cited the rhetorical style of satirical prints, it also employed features of the classical landscape tradition, history, painting, and portraiture. The print straddles, in other words, different generic modes. This generic instability captures the challenge Barrie and his peers were confronting, namely the incommensurability of existing pictorial formats with their new political reality. And the reproductive logic of printmaking itself made the question unavoidable on material terms as well. That's part of the exciting move that Esther makes in her reading of this. Barrie used both etching and aquatint to produce the print. The latter, aquatint, must have appealed to Barrie because this relatively new technique freed artists from the traditional technical requirements of line engraving. Even the irregular modeled effect of foul biting, which you can see down here, spilling into the lower margin of the print could be read metaphorically then, Chadwick proposes, Esther proposes, in relation to the Rousseauian idea that refinement stood at odds with the freedom and the moral purity of mankind's raw state. In both its content and the material practices through which it was made, Barrie's print asks, how faithfully must something resemble its received precedent? And what techniques are adequate to the forging but also the representing of a new world? In the argument's most compressed and playful expression, Chadwick writes that Barrie's printmaking unfolded during a period in which, quote, the nature of the connection between an existing state, which Burke calls the mother country, the matrix, shall we say, and its offspring came under pressing scrutiny, end quote. In other words, she's inviting us to consider the relationship between the print matrix and the paper copies it produces as an expression of the relationship between an imperial metropole and its colonies. The American Revolution poses the question, what if the copy were not like the original? What if it were better? What if the copy was a site of creation rather than replication? I found it impossible not to reflect here on how Omi Baba's famous discussion of colonial mimicry could be activated in this context, and on how Natasha Eaton's important formulation of a flexible, multi-directional colonial mimesis could also find expression in the material protocols of printmaking in Britain and its imperial networks. And Esther's argument also brought to my mind another technique through which Barrie maps out the relationship between Britain and one of its colonies, and that's landscape. The landscape of America, which you see, is abundant, which is what you would expect in a sort of semi-allegorical print like this, but its abundance takes a specific form that would have had contemporary purchase for its British viewers. First, tall evergreens to the left of the temple and seen again in the distance. Imported massive American evergreens had become a staple of fashionable elite landscape design in late 18th century Britain and France. More than this, I'm struck by their compositional alignment with the pillars of the Temple of American Liberty, by the implication that the ample domestic supply of timber would structurally support it. Britain, of course, had long ago ceased being able to rely exclusively on domestic growth for its timber needs. Timber was, it bears remembering, the primary material used for construction, domestic heat, and also as charcoal, the energy source for growing industries like glassworks and ironworks, for furnaces and forges. Timber, and especially the lack of enough timber, was an imperial concern for Britain as well. It was needed to build the ships that transacted the business of Britain's imperial and mercantile networks. And as Keith Plumers argues in a recent book, the rhetoric of timber scarcity was commonly evoked in late 18th century Britain as justification for imperial expansion. Returning to the print, I also note that to the right of the temple, sheep graze freely. Behind them, improbably large oxen pull a plow. And the space between them and also into the depths of the scene unfolds without interruption. Is this a landscape of enclosure? I think not. Now, we have sophisticated tools for analyzing the politics of enclosure in early 19th century landscape painting. Given the book's relocation of political significance from painting to print, and given that it focuses on the decades during which what we might call extractive capitalism was consolidated, I wondered how printmaking's radical politics might be understood then to engage with mass forced displacement, violent uprisings in the countryside, and the drastic reorganization of labor practices that were brought about by the growth of industrial manufacturing and mining in the final decades of the 18th century. Esther alludes tantalizingly to this in her later discussion of Bewick, which Johanna is going to be speaking about. Bewick was based in Newcastle and was intimately connected to coal mining. Esther focuses on how Bewick's natural history prints engaged with the period's debates about paper money and the status of referentiality therein. Might they likewise bear some understanding of the protocols of extraction, the rise of an economic system predicated on self-accelerating, coordinated efforts to quantify, optimize, circulate, and monetize portions of the natural environment? In 1800, the largest copper mine in the world was in Wales. Do copperplate engravings from this period have some material awareness of the networks of extraction and energy-intensive smelting through which they were produced? What might that look like for Barry, who, before he could enjoy the quote-unquote freedom of the aquatint technique, would have first treated his copperplate, would have heated it, would have known that there were procedures and material preconditions, that there were encounters between people and copper that enabled his so-called artistic freedom? Those were a few of the thoughts that were sort of zipping around my mind as I worked through Esther's really stunning first chapter.
Right. Well, first, many congratulations to Esther. Wow, what a remarkable book. This is a really incredible achievement, and I think those of you who know Esther and her work, as those of you who know Esther and her work would expect, it's deeply erudite and imaginative throughout, and obviously essential reading for those of us who work on this period, who work on prints. But I think it's actually also a truly significant contribution to art history writ large, and a really wonderful intervention, an important intervention in our discipline. In short, what I'm saying is you should all read it, and you should read it from start to finish, and then read it again. You won't regret it. I have to say it's been a singularly difficult task to isolate a single image from this book to focus on. Not only is it a particularly beautifully illustrated book, but the variety of really compelling images is truly stunning, and Esther has many brilliant things to say about all of them. In the third chapter of The Radical Print, Esther looks to the work of the younger artist, James Gillray. It's against the book's agenda, really, to consider him an artist apart. Much of the book, this isn't perhaps apparent immediately in the structure, but much of the book is about undoing precisely that kind of romantic mythos. Yet the focus is not on the minutiae of Gillray's political iconography, explaining the jokes and so on, or his romantic persona. Rather, in Esther's telling, Gillray was an artist who explicated with uncanny intensity the materials, processes, and contingencies of the paper age. I don't think I can do a particularly effective job of summarizing this chapter, as it does many things very subtly, but as I was reading, I started to mark what seemed to me like useful words, and I think they might substitute for that, although others would probably have different highlights, and I realise this is effectively cheating. But here are some in no particular order that might give some sense of the chapter's texture, itself a key word here. Blockage, contestation, counterimage, information, transmission, communication, distortion, delay, disruption, diversion, reception, intelligence, spying, sedition, deferral, channels, privacy, exposure, epistolary, flurries, feedback, receiving, processing, outputting, folding, sealing, posting, intimacy and distance, time lags, duration, ephemera, misinterpretation and dissemblance, proof, puffs, paper, noise. I'll come back to these in a minute. The chapter begins on relatively stable ground, the vexed relationship between printmakers and the Academy, via a virtuoso reading of a detail of a child engraver in a corner of Gillray's 1789 Shakespeare Sacrificed, clutching a burin and a revolutionary bonnet rouge, soon to become established as the most recognisable ritual attribute of radical revolution. Gillray was quick off the mark here. Print and politics in one neat manoeuvre. But such hierarchies, however contested, soon disintegrate through print itself. Lawful liberty, liberty without law, here. Unfinished, a print that was probably rejected because of its ambivalence, does exactly this, although the means it does so is through the very form of the binary, the contrast print turned against itself. We see the ground layer of aquatint, with dead infants in white negative space, yet to be outlined, all the more haunting because of it. As Esther puts it, like a dark undercurrent, the brooding liquidity of the aquatint emphasizes non-containment, accident, and blur. Substance becomes insubstantial, light, shadow. It's precisely printmaking's material intelligence, the affordances of aquatint here, but more generally processes of reversal and stopping out that imbues this scene with meaning. As always in this book, process is the ground of politics. Gillray, as Esther writes, made the sinews of the paper age into the basis of his whole artistic practice, and I love this, the sinews of paper. It's sort of somehow so evocative, both bodily and material, a substance of connection and animation. And that paper is everywhere, forming a kind of hysterical mise en abîme with the substrate of the prints themselves, and one could pick most of the works in this chapter, to be honest. How about the apotheosis of Hoche with its sans-culotte cherub and French Revolutionary paper money, assignats floating in great drifts from this secular heaven. Elsewhere, prints are made in response to a series of intercepted letters, probably invented, expressing French officers' disillusionment with Napoleon's Egyptian campaign. Never sticking to one side, Gillray undercut the authority of his source material, even as he made satirical capital from these fictive interceptions. His works thus operate as a kind of interception in their own right, an impedance in the channel, quite literally in some cases, where the response to revolutionary France and its own communicative imperatives forms the main subject. And I think here too of a work such as Gillray's French Telegraph, Signalling in the Dark. But perhaps an earlier print, representing Governor, I don't know how to say this really, Governor Gallstone, inspired by Alecto, or The Birth of Minerva from 1790, makes the point more sharply. A satire on Philip Thickness, marine officer and defender of slavery, full of papers, both material and phantasmatic, with broadsides and books blasting out of Thickness's head. The print was accompanied by a series of handbills, some of which were sent out by post, producing what Esther calls a cacophony of accusations and counter-accusations surrounding the print ahead of its arrival. And Esther describes these as forming a kind of form of reverse psychology in the way that they operated. flurries, feedback, receiving, processing, outputting, proof, puffs, paper, noise. This feedback process made explicit the extent to which Gillray's practice was part of a cross-media information circuit that connected individual recipients and a broader public. The terms used here, while grounded at all times in the sense of their historical specificity and in Gillray's artistic practice, are redolent of those we might expect to see in more recent media theory, although that's not really made explicit in the text. This is it's a very learned book, and most of these things come from the works themselves in really convincing ways. But take visual noise, for example. Yves Lambois, reviving aspects of the information theory pioneered by Claude Shannon and Warren Weaver, has investigated the presence of visual noise in American artist Ed Ruscha's word paintings. In that context, Bois describes, and this is Bois, what is lost, forgotten, usually unseen, unheard, taken for granted, ignored as mere noise. The size and scale of letters, the phonetic flutter, the grammatic alliterations, but also the pattern of oil droppings on parking lots, the vacant real estate opportunities in the urban landscape, the metaphors in the robotized language of mass media, in other words, the refuse, that which is destined for the gutter of oblivion. And I think there's a really nice parallel here with Esther's reading of Gillray's prints. In many ways, his prints embodied a kind of secret or blockage whose interpretation exceeded the bounds of available knowledge, even as their outward manifestation was enacted in full sight, but in a manner not wholly distinct from Bois' account of Ruscha's declarative logos. Their presence also pointed to something more damaged or entropic, leaving waste and decay in their wake. The phonetic flutter of Gillray's prints is one thing, but this book demands that we look too to the rest, something close to what's called texture here, the scratches, dots and marks that happen in between the ostensible subjects of Gillray's prints, the matter of interference and delay. As Esther writes, the spaces and mechanisms of mediation are always material and therefore always political. We might add that they're historical too. Gillray is an artist who's often perceived as in some way transhistorical and digestible, despite the complexity of his prints, legible across the ages, sometimes neutralized in the process. Thinking about Gillray as texture rather than text gives us a different version of this artist, demanding that we think about his work as print, in a world of print. It's just one of the many achievements of this superb book, and I'm really looking forward to discussing it and to teaching with it and learning from it for many years to come. So thank you, Esther.
Well, that was very challenging acts to follow. I'm a bit of an outlier here because, as you have noted, I'm not actually a specialist in this period or even this country, and I think it speaks to Esther's generosity and her receptivity as a scholar and her ambitions for this book that she invited me to respond to the book, and I'm really grateful because it gave me an opportunity to sort of dive deeper into your work. And I see the connections to my own work, and I agree with all of the praise that has already been given to this really astonishingly, I think, eminently readable book. So I do encourage all of you from any type of specialty or sort of area of expertise to please read the book. I'm going to be focusing on the chapter about Bewick's currency that focuses on Thomas Bewick. And what particularly interested me about this chapter is how Esther characterizes Bewick's work as political, not due to his biography or to the print's iconography or subject matter. And she notes that actually Bewick only made one directly political print in 1789, an anti-slavery vignette, but rather that its politics are registered via his work's engagement in broader social and economic systems, and its really, I think, his problematization of representation itself, which is a theme you've heard the other panelists touch upon. So this is something that comes into view when his output is considered holistically, without relegating his commercial work below his celebrated book illustrations, such as The History of British Birds, probably his best known work, which I've included a tailpiece vignette from here, which features Bewick's own fingerprint, which Esther, another eloquent formulation, describes as a, quote, a kind of trompe-l'oeil intended to simulate indexicality. So Esther, as you've heard, really insists on what she calls active traffic between Bewick's book illustration and his commercial work, and specifically his work as an engraver of banknotes, where he also deployed trompe-l'oeil, in this case to give the appearance of one print medium resembling another, namely copper plates, to look like wood engraving. This particular banknote was commissioned by the Cumberland and Carlisle Bank, who wanted a note that cannot be forged. And Esther very closely analyzes what she talks about as this virtuosic technical feat, wherein the floral design you see on the left-hand side has actually been created through an elaborate system of variegated lines in which the points at which those lines and sort of this grid end are, and I hope I'm describing this accurately, the points at which these lines stop and start actually generate the boundaries of the flower's petals and stems. So again, I think this running theme of the matrix I'm hearing come up. So across both of these works, that thumbprint vignette and this banknote, we see evidence of the ways that Bewick was self-reflexively, and following Esther, she really emphasizes this as recursively, both self-reflexively and recursively question and deconstruct the representational codes of the print medium. And while the immediate purpose of Bewick's intricacy here is anti-forgery, his design also offers a statement, Esther argues, on the value of individual artistry and expression. And in doing so, sets up an analogy between monetary and creative or artistic value. Esther's analysis of this banknote and also of the fingerprint or the thumbprint tailpiece opens my eyes to the ways that Bewick's printmaking is animated by the tension between his own individual artistic authorship and broader systems of representation, semiotic, allegorical, but particularly, and scientific. We've seen the history of British birds, but I think particularly economic in this chapter, Bewick's currency. And by examining his commercial engraving practice, like this banknote, alongside his print work, in his natural history prints, illuminates how the political economy of his work leads us to see him really as an artist of systems, an artist engaged in systems, aware of systems and the ways that they relate and connect, and who really internalized the relationships between different systems of meaning and value. And in many ways was also uniquely positioned to critique them. Bewick himself wrote, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, "System after system have passed away, but do the laws of nature ever alter? Do the human passions operate in any other way than they did thousands of years ago? No, indeed." So in my remaining time, I want to glance, since I am a 20th and 21st century person, at a few artists who self-reflexively merged art and currency in order to explore these similar tensions between authorship and systems, and to generate, in all of their cases, I think, twofold critiques of artistic value and the political economy of art. So my first thought when looking at this banknote was these artists' checks, very well known by Duchamp and Klein, often invoked, particularly lately, in the discourse around NFTs. And yet the signifiers of artistic originality in these checks is really confined to the artist's signature, and their handwriting, but particularly their signature. And in this sense, these checks are really situated in the history and discourse of the ready-made. Perhaps I would venture a more productive comparison comes in the form of the San Francisco-based artist Bruce Conner and his work Legal Tender, which is a stack of 30 double-sided offset lithographs wrapped in a paper band that was included in the SMS portfolio, SMS standing for Shit Must Stop, a limited edition serial portfolio that was published by William Copley in the late 60s. The lithographs are based on Conner's signature psychedelic pen and ink drawings, and they extend and elaborate on Bewick's self-reflexive treatment of banknotes through their intricacy, which recalls Bewick's very virtuosic anti-forgery designs, but also, I think, through their seduction of the eye, through trickery, through play, and critical mimesis, including even Conner's use of the green, black, and white ink scheme of US print money. Another key example that came to mind was the Brazilian artist Cildo Morelos, who turned to print currency for his 1970 project, Insertions into Ideological Circuits. Now, unlike Bruce Conner, who creates sort of his own psychedelic currency as a limited edition, Morelos' authorship here is registered via sort of a series of direct stamps. He's intervening directly into these ideological circuits, aka the global paper money system, by way of these critical statements that he stamps on real currencies. This is real money that he's defacing, breaking the law and doing so. So, for instance, he issues a demand in Portuguese for direct elections or straight elections, and then he stamps an English language announcement of the Ideological Circuits project on a $1 bill right next to the portrait of George Washington. And I think it's important to keep in mind here, I've pulled out these two notes, these two pieces of currency, but the relationship due to the US government's direct support for the Brazilian military dictatorship. So mapping these connections. Now, as a self-pronounced systems artist, Morelos has inserted his political intervention into these pre-existing financial circuits. He's parasitically feeding off of capitalist exchange in order to disrupt and critique its smooth flow. So we might compare this subversive act to Bewick's vivid banknote embellishments, which of course were ostensibly intended to prevent forgery and thus facilitate capitalist exchange. But at the same time, they literalized the value of his own expressive authorship in ways that persist and flourish, not in spite of, but in fact because of their commercial form. And I will end there. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all so much. I think the plan was to have a little bit of a conversation while the author catches her breath, unless the breath has been caught. I think this was this was a great object lesson of why everyone here should read the book, because it's obviously such a productive and surprising text that we all learned so much from and are privileged to think about. So, any thoughts?
Well, firstly, I'm very much lost for words at your generosity and the time that you've given up to read, and you are my ideal readers, all four of you, and I really can't thank you enough. Nick, Richard, Steph, and Johanna, thank you very, very much indeed for those inspiring remarks and responses, and I'll come back to a few thoughts in a second, but while I've got the mic, good evening everyone, and thank you to you for coming. It's really wonderful to see such a great crowd this evening. It's a real honour for me. So thank you to the audience. Thank you to the PMC, the Paul Mellon Centre, to Emily Lease, Tom Powell, Sarah Turner, who are here this evening, who really brought the book to fruition. Mark Hallett, our director here at the Courtauld, who was then, when this book really became a book, was director of the Paul Mellon Centre. I'm completely indebted to you, so thank you very much indeed. There are many people who aren't here this evening: Tim Barringer, Gillian Forrester, my teachers at Yale, and former colleagues at the British Museum, many others who I try to thank in my acknowledgements. Thank you. And thank you, of course, to the Courtauld and to all my Courtauld colleagues. Courtauld is just the ideal environment to be a scholar, and of course somewhere that has actually also funded the 200 images in the book alongside the PMC. And lastly, to the Research Forum, to Diego and colleagues for organising this evening. Thank you so much. So friends, family and colleagues, thank you. Right, to the business of trying to say something about your fantastic remarks, and I don't want to keep us further from wine, so I'll just keep it brief. But Steph, is there such a thing as a reactionary print? Does self-reflexivity automatically make a print radical? I haven't got answers to this right now, but I would like to say that in this book, this term radical operates in a kind of layered way and operates in a kind of multifarious way. It's quite an unstable term. And my use of this title, the radical print, it's doing a few things. First of all, it's drawing attention to the ways in which these prints intersect with and work with and against what contemporaries what would not have called, but what has come to be called radical discourse of this period of the late 18th century. But more than that, it is, and I think that Nick, one of you alluded to this idea of the radical as something that goes to the root, that these images are kind of working at the fundament of representation. And that's the kind of way in which I wanted to activate the term. We've had wonderful scholarship in the field of British prints. I'm thinking of Tim Clayton's book, The English Print, for example, that came out in 1997 and is one of a number of books that make this kind of work possible, for just laying the groundwork of and giving us this picture of print culture in Britain, Mark Hallett's work too. But this idea of the English print, I wanted to say the radical print, just to kind of get to that sense of kind of activation, and that, you know, print is something that is and printmakers is working actively with their materials, but also with politics. And then extractivism. I was very glad that you found a way to think about timber in Barry's Phoenix, because I know that is central to your forthcoming, right, book, which is fabulous.
Talk about your book.
That's really interesting, and I think, you know, one could pursue the whole kind of material history question to say copper itself as a material, which I don't do here, but I'd love to do, and I think there's lots of scope to do that. So I'm really grateful for you for bringing that up. It's a fascinating thought. Pursuing these prints into the minds, as it were, would be a really interesting exercise. Richard, thank you for your key words. As ever, you've hit the nail on the head. Politics is always a process. Gillray as texture, not text. And thank you for bringing in Yvan Amboise. As you point out, not someone that I engage with in the book itself, but I'm really glad that you see.
I don't think you need to.
I'm really glad that you see that kind of parallel and the sort of traction there with that kind of theory. I know that I risk, I think, in treating Gillray the way I do, being charged with sort of forgetting that Gillray is meant to be funny somehow. I know that some people feel very protective about this idea. Well, you know, Gillray was just funny. You're overcomplicating things. And somehow killing the humour, but I think that is to actually radically underestimate Gillray as an artist and the kind of real sophistication of his work as an image maker. So yes, thank you for that. And then Johanna, I'm delighted that you did see why I wanted you to be involved this evening, and why I wanted someone who thinks deeply about modern and contemporary art to engage with this book. I actually haven't thought about the relation to Yves Klein and the Duchamp artist checks, but that's fantastic and really interesting. Sildomierles, insertions into ideological circuits, I have thought about actually in comparison to Thomas Spence's overwritten tokens, which, so Thomas Spence, who was an associate of Bewick in Newcastle, came to London, was a key part of the so-called radical underworld in London. And one of the things that he did was to stamp current coin with his radical slogans, Spence's plan, you fools, overthrow the landlords, that kind of thing, and then reinsert those into circulation. And indeed, it was a class that I took with David Joslett at Yale as a graduate student in my first term of graduate school in 2007. And this artist was discussed. I had just come from Cambridge, where the most contemporary work I'd thought about was from 1914. And this was completely mind-blowing to me, that this could be thought about as artistic practice. And it was that was the kernel of my interest in these kinds of interventions into circulation and thinking about art in this expanded sense. So yeah, I'm delighted that caught your eye too. And I'll just end by saying that, yeah, a larger motivation for writing this book has been to try to speak beyond the field of 18th century Britain, certainly beyond the field of printmaking, which is totally wonderful and marvellous and invaluable, but I want to try and break printmaking out of that, what can often be a kind of bubble, and allow this to speak much more broadly to the discipline as a whole. So thank you again, and thank you all for coming. It really is so meaningful. Thank you.
Well, we will be ending firmly at 6:30 at the latest, but I do know there's a lot of people here who came to celebrate, but also perhaps to ask questions. I had one just follow on what you were talking about, Esther, which was that when I finished your book, it was interesting because I felt like in a way you had, by writing this book, almost made it obsolete, right? You had made a whole book about print, right, and told us just how interesting it was, in a way to almost make more books that are only about print, obsolete, right? Because you both sort of tell us not that, I mean, it's wonderful to write books about prints, obviously, but you know what I mean, to break it open, to let it breathe, right? And to show us both what is so particular about print, but also then to really allow it to participate even more fully in the world the world of art.
Yeah, well, thank you. I hope that it can do that. I hope it doesn't render books on print obsolete.
No,
but we need more of them. But yes, absolutely. I mean, thinking about the moment at which this book arrives, I guess, I mean, from my part, it's been a long time in the making and should have been done much earlier than it was. But it does coincide with a moment where thinking about print is possible in these ways, in new ways, because of what museums have done to digitize print collections. I'm thinking particularly of the British Museum online collections, which, I mean, they have managed to digitize every single one of their works on paper, which count into the millions. I mean, it really is extraordinary. And the ability to access those prints digitally online at such high resolution is, I mean, one could have a whole conversation about that because it's interesting in its own right. But that has made print scholarship possible. I mean, we're witnessing there has been in the last decade or so a real efflorescence of scholarship around prints. I mean, I'm thinking also, and people who are not necessarily born and bred print scholars, thinking about print in newly interesting ways because of the new access that we've been granted to it. This paradoxical thing where the print is originally, at least in theory, most of the time, a very highly public thing that then gets locked away in print rooms and is actually paradoxically harder to access oftentimes than paintings which hang, on the walls of galleries. That has begun to be reversed in the last 10 years, and I think that that's why so many interesting books on print have been able to come out. I mean, thinking also of Jennifer Roberts' new book, Contact, Art and the Pull of Print, which came out kind of after I'd written, as it were, the first version of this, but subsequently really gave me such a useful kind of vocabulary and kind of a sense that there were other people thinking about these things and speaking that language. So it is really nice to feel part of that kind of wave, as it were.
Yeah.
But yeah, thanks for the question.
Any questions from our wonderful and rapt audience?
Oh, I have a question. This is a question that sometimes people ask at book launches. I'm wondering if you could tell us just about a moment of joy or revelation that you had in this project, in the archive or just in the process of revising.
Joy and revelation abounded during the process of writing this. Gosh, it's very hard to point to a single thing. I mean, obviously, the thing that I love the most is kind of going into the archival rabbit hole and just feeling the texture of the letters, of the prints themselves, turning prints over, looking on the back, you know, just getting one's hands dirty, as it were, but not dirty. In that process of being in the archive. I think I've mentioned this to many before, but the sort of, not exactly eureka moment, but a really important moment for me was being shown Barry's Phoenix for the first time in the print room at Yale, where Nick and Ali and others were trained, and just by Gillian Forrester, who isn't here tonight, but is someone I really owe a debt of thanks to. And just sort of thinking, my God, that is such a weird and wonderful thing. And I just want to understand where this thing is. I've never seen anything like it, was kind of my, and I'd seen pictures of Barry's Progress of Culture paintings in the Society of Arts before. And I remember actually laughing out loud in a graduate seminar, thinking how utterly ridiculous and awful they were. Anyway, I mean, I've completely revised my view of Barry. I think he's great. But it was that print that kind of, it just something about the aesthetic of it I just loved, and I just wanted to pursue. I wanted to investigate, and so that maybe slightly mythologizing things, but is a bit of an originary moment.
Thank you, Esther. I look forward to reading this book. It was the phrase phonetic flutter, I think, that came from Richard in relation to Gillray, and that, or perhaps another.
By someone else, yeah.
Opposing texture versus text as one of the lessons they learned from that, and I wanted to ask you to revisit that. Binary, and whether it really is a binary. I'm thinking of a book that was just about prints, one of the books that you've maybe relegated to oblivion, by McAllister Johnson, who's a Canadian scholar of print, called The Versified Print. And he quoted a print seller from the 18th century who said it was commercially unviable to publish a print without text, without a legend to interpret and guide the viewer. And as we know, most of the captions or text that accompanied images were often conceived and imposed by editors. I'm thinking about prints that begin to be produced in France in the 20s and 30s that are images without text, as if the image is liberating itself finally from the text. And what struck me about many of these, including actually the images on the screen, is that the text seems to become not a scaffolding that's coming from a publishing system or industry, but a tool of the artist, a piece of information and expression that the artist can introduce into the image, whether in the legend field or in the Blake Rayakuan image all over the image, so that text and texture are that the texture of the print importantly incorporates text rather than being your implied opposition of text. So I just wondered if you would reflect on that.
Yeah, well, thank you for those thoughts. Really, really interesting indeed. I mean, I think this idea of Gillray as texture, not text, is more in a way a kind of methodological or historiographical intervention, which is that Gillray's prints have been endlessly and necessarily analysed according to what they contain and the particular political arguments that they were intervening in or satirising, lampooning. And that I'm thinking particularly of Dorothy George's absolutely foundational catalogue of satires at the British Museum. That work is completely essential, but what it might do is encourage us to focus only on, as it were, iconography and content. The texture idea is that these are also objects that think carefully literally about texture. So the aquatint grain is mobilized to mean something. When Gillray experiments with textured soft grounds in ways that really don't happen again until the 20th century and experimental printmaking in Paris, he's mobilizing texture again as part of his thinking about obfuscation or veiling and so on. So it's to try and move away from simply kind of political iconography and more into the meanings of materiality.
And he is actually scripting the text?
So yes,
his handwriting?
Yeah. In Gillray's case, yes, and he was trained by, his first training came apprentice to Harry Ashby, who was a professional engraver in London, who would be the sort of person that would engrave all your certificates or your, shop bills, and so he was trained primarily and first as a writing engraver, and that skill in then being able to, hugely virtuosic skill to be able to craft all of that text backwards. That set him up. So yeah, all of the text on Gillray's prints is his own. But I totally agree that it's fundamental to how the prints operate. I mean, across all of these artists, the very textiness of these objects is a way that meshes these objects in what I call the paper age. So it meshes them with a culture of pamphlets and banknotes and newspapers, precisely because of these kind of overlapping elements.
Thank you.
The time has come first to congratulate Esther again and to thank everyone for their contributions. And there will be a reception, there will be books, buy, more commerce, more paper or paperless, and time to have a glass of wine. But thank you and congratulations.
Thank you.